so this is my outline. If it's wrong, it's on you, and I'm learning it wrong on my own. So, okay, we're going to do consideration and then promissory estoppel, kind of the opposite ends of the spectrum. So consideration says, what is the exchange? And it needs to be a benefit to the offeror or a detriment to the acceptee. I call them the or and the e. So, okay. So we have two different theories. We have the value theory and the bargain theory. And so the value theory looks at the substance of the contract. So it basically says, you asked, I did, game over. Okay? So a promise by itself is not binding. There must be something of substantive value being exchanged. So it's a promise if. I promise this if you this. It's not just I promise this. That puts us into promissory estoppel category. This is if I promise this if. The if is what we hinge it on. So you asked, I did, game over is value theory. A valuable consideration may consist either of some right, interest, profit, or benefit accruing to the one party, or some forbearance, detriment, loss, or responsibility given, suffered, or undertaken by the other. So this is the Sidway case. The uncle said, I don't want you to drink, smoke, any all of that stuff. And then at the end of that time, there was some problems with the estate and they didn't want to give it. And they said, no, this guy gave up his legal right and therefore game over. You asked, I did, game over. That's value theory. In general, a waiver of any legal right at the request of another party is sufficient consideration for a promise. Legal right. Restatement 75 says exchange of a promise for a promise only if performance would be consideration. Performance has some value. Restatement 75. So if it's unilateral, the performance must give a value. Okay, sometimes I don't understand my notes, and that's okay. All right, bargain theory. So the bargain theory is about the bargain. It's about the trade of something, where the value theory is you asked, I did, game over, very linear. The bargain theory is process of creating the contract, basically. Offered, accepted, your promise induced me to do this, and my inducement induced you to promise. Like, here we go. It's back and forth. This is a bargain. Consideration consists of a benefit to the promisor or a detriment to the promisee. Consideration must be bargained for as the exchange for the promise. So the consideration is inducing the promise or the performance. The promise must induce the detriment, and the detriment must induce the promise. When promisor is benefited by the E condition, that is a strong indicator that there is consideration. So a benefit to the promisor, that's strong evidence that there's consideration. Sometimes an actual bargain does not need to exist, but there needs to be the relation of reciprocal conventional inducement, each for the other. So Restatement 71, requirement of exchange and types of exchange. To constitute consideration, a performance or return promise must be bargained for. A performance or return promise is bargained for if it is sought by the promisor in exchange for his promise and is given to the promisee in exchange for that promise. Restatement 79, adequacy of consideration, mutuality of obligation. No, I already decided I didn't have that in my notes. Okay, so if the requirement of consideration is met, there is no additional requirement. Again, a mere pretense of bargain does not suffice, as whether there is false recital of consideration or where the purported consideration is merely nominal. Okay, so here we have a bit of a conundrum between 71 and 79, because 79 says, somehow I'm thinking it's 73. You don't need to know the numbers. There is a rule that says if consideration is found, it doesn't matter how nominal it will be, it's consideration, game over, we're good. Then there's another restatement, also in the 70s. Sorry, I don't have it in front of me. There's another one that says nominal consideration will not be found. So how do we reconcile those things? So we reconcile those things. The bargain theory, it's a little easier to, so basically the one that says nominal consideration isn't consideration is going to deal with egregious. So like, I'm going to sell you my car for a penny. They're going to be like, that penny did not induce that person to give you the car. Like, that didn't happen. So the problem, so in the bargain theory, because the bargain theory is looking at quid pro quo. Okay, so like if it was, hey, I'm going to sell you my house for $1,000, that's not so egregious. Like, that is a little weird, but like, it's not egregious. So a court would probably say, okay, like there was a bargain, there was quid pro quo, it was bargained for, detriment, benefit, we're clear here. But the value theory has a problem because if there is nominal consideration, the value theory says you asked, I did, game over. And so the value theory has a little more problem as well. But basically they're trying to get to justice. So if they're trying to get to justice, if it looks unjust and the consideration is so nominal that it just makes it even that much more, it's going to raise some red flags. So that's how you account for it. But what the court is not going to do is they're not going to look at like the $1,000 for a house and say, well, like we're going to stop this contract because it was a bad deal. That's not what they're doing. They're basically trying to get a read on like things that really strike the conscience of like, no, this consideration didn't induce this promise. That didn't happen. But the value theory has more problems. So it's about, and the bargain theory is about a reciprocal exchange. Okay, so that's that. Statement 79. Okay, so if consideration is met, like it doesn't matter if you don't like it, if the court doesn't like it, like that's, unless it's kind of egregious. Okay, so the hypo for that was like, a man wants to give his son $1,000, but he doesn't want to give it as a gift, so he sells him a worthless book for $1,000. And then you would say like, no, $1 isn't. Again, bargain theory, you'd say quid pro quo, $1,000 for trash that's not a thing. But in the value theory, you're like, hey, you asked, I did, game over. Offer, acceptance, give me the goods. Sometimes consideration requires that a contractual promise be the product of a bargain. However, in the usage of bargain does not mean an exchange of things of equivalence or of any value. It means a negotiation resulting in the voluntary assumption of an obligation by one party upon the condition of an act or forbearance by the other. Consideration thus ensures that the promise enforces a contract is not accidental, casual, or gratuitous, but but has been uttered intentionally as the result of some deliberation manifested by reciprocal bargaining or negotiation. Bargain induces an action. Buyer includes promise for a promise. Okay. Conditional promise versus consideration. So it is not enough, however, that the promisee has suffered a legal detriment at the request of the promisor. The detriment incurred must be the quid pro quo, or the price of the promise and the inducement for which it was made. If the promisor merely intends to make a gift of the promisee upon the performance of a condition, the promise is gratuitous, and the satisfaction of the condition is not consideration for a contract. That also goes for I should really have made this bigger. I did make it bigger. Hold on. This is my flow chart. I have lots of them, but this is like a super tiny one that I can't read. So I had to make it bigger. Okay, so what is not consideration? Gifts, conditional gifts. This is the tramp hypo. So like, hey, if you go around the corner to the store, I'll buy you a jacket. Like, going around the corner to the store was not consideration. That was just like a precondition. Like, you need to go there so I can buy it for you. It can't be for someone's altruistic pleasure. That is not consideration. Moral decisions are not consideration. And it can't be for past consideration. It can't be like, oh, I'm so thankful that you did this for me, so now I'm going to give this to you, or I'm going to pay you. Like, past consideration doesn't cut it either. So that's the tramp. But in our tramp hypo, if the offerer asked the tramp to go around the corner and get him some eggs and bring them, and then he would buy him a coat, or just bring me, like, you have eggs, I have a coat, please come to my store, go around the block, go to my store, bring me some eggs, and I will give you a coat. Then the eggs then you have an exchange, and the store is still a precondition, but the eggs are consideration for the coat. It's a bargain. Moral consideration, past consideration, not consideration. In pension cases, arriving at an office to pick up a check, that's a precondition. That's not a thing. That's not considered consideration. Okay, problem of using both value theory and bargain. Newman and Sonnell's bank case, woman takes husband's promissory note, that is worthless. So the value theory says clearly no consideration because the note is worthless. Bargain theory says maybe there is considerations because she said she'd take the note and she agreed to it. But that's one of those egregious things, like this had no value, and so there is the quid pro quo kind of breaks down. There is the opposite of what we were talking about before, where the bargain theory can hold up better. Or the bargain theory in nominal has a problem holding up, but the value theory says, hey, like A plus B equals C. And C's for consideration. Yes. Okay, so then you have Restatement 77, and that is about illusory or alternative promises. A promise or apparent promise is not consideration if by its terms the promisor or purported promisor reserves a choice of alternative performances unless each of the alternative performances would have been consideration if it alone has been bargained for. Okay, so this is like an aunt tells her niece, hey, if you come to my house, you can live here. So the coming to the house is a precondition. It's not consideration. But if the aunt says, hey, you can come live with me if you either walk my dog every day or make dinner every night. So the walking the dog or the making of dinner would separately be considered consideration, and therefore those things are both those things can stand alone. If it was, hey, you can either walk my dog or you can sit on the couch watching TV, you might go, well, sitting on the couch watching TV all day is probably not a quid pro quo for living somewhere. Please, please, please don't test us on that. Okay, so then we're on to promissory estoppel. And promissory estoppel is kind of the opposite of consideration. It's where there is a promise and there is no consideration, but there is reasonable reliance. So, and we're talking about gifts here. So there's no offer and acceptance. Exactly. Promissory estoppel is restatement 90, and it has elements. So we like elements because they're easy to just follow down the trail. So elements are a promise, which reasonably induces action or forbearance that then does induce action or forbearance, and the remedy must be granted for justice's sake. So the hypo in class was a boy gets into college in New York, but he's like, I don't have the money to do that. I don't think I'm going to accept. And the grandfather says, please accept. I will give you $10,000 to cover your living expenses in New York. And so the boy enrolls in college, and then he puts a deposit down in an apartment for $4,000. And then the grandfather is like, I'm sorry, I've fallen on hard times. I cannot give you the $10,000 that I promised. Well, now there was a promise. The promise was to help him move to New York City. So when he was given the promise, he relied on that promise to then go and get an apartment in New York City, which he probably cannot afford without that promise. So he relied on that promise to do what he did. And now the remedy must be granted for justice's sake. So this requires detrimental reliance. So like, I wouldn't have done this without you. I have shown the detriment. It can't be like, well, I was going to do this. It's not for future detriment. It's like, I have incurred detriment already. And that is what justice needs to help me with. So the court will say, well, if this will be binding if the defendant should have reasonably anticipated the plaintiff's action upon reliance of that promise. But we have 90 subsection 2, which is subscriptions to charitable organizations. And the problem, okay, so here we have the same elements. So you have a promise. You have to have a promise. You have to have a promise. A promise that would reasonably induce action or forbearance that did induce action and forbearance, and that for justice's sake, we need to provide the court needs to provide a remedy. In subsection 2, it says that the charitable organization does not need to show substantial reliance on the promise. That's the difference. But a lot of courts ask for it. Some courts say, we're not asking for it, but we're asking for it. So there's a little difference there. And a gift, it's not a I promise if. A gift is just, I promise you this. And then the people acted upon knowing that they had this promise, and therefore, bam. If there's there's no quid pro quo. If there's a quid pro quo, then you can go to maybe it is consideration. Okay, so let's go back. There has to be a promise. We had one case where there was not just a promise you could sink your teeth into, and they still made it, and that was a little more about like a big company, little company thing, and they were like looking out for the little guys. Is it good law? It makes it messy. So Restatement 87 says, where an offeror should reasonably expect their offer to induce action, and it does, it may be binding to avoid injustice, and it becomes an irrevocable offer. So promissory estoppel is about becoming an irrevocable offer. Ladies and gents, that's all I got.